Hey guys! Tonight we begin a journey through one of history's most scandalous secrets, a secret so shocking that it would make even today's most controversial billionaires blush. Picture this. What if I told you that some of the most powerful kings in European history didn't just tolerate prostitution, they actually ran it like a business empire? What if the very monarchs who proclaimed divine right and moral authority were secretly the biggest pimps of their time? And what if this wasn't just about a few rogue rulers, but an entire economic system that shaped kingdoms for over 1,000 years? Before we dive deep into this incredible story together, I'd love it if you could hit that subscribe button and give this video a like, but only if you're genuinely enjoying what we're uncovering tonight. And hey, I'm curious. Where are you watching from right now? Are you tucked into bed, sitting by a window, maybe traveling somewhere far from home? Drop a comment and let me know. I love hearing about the different corners of the world where our stories find you. Now, dim those lights, get comfortable, maybe turn on a gentle fan for some white noise, and let's step back in time together. You know, when we think about medieval kings, we usually picture them in gleaming armor, sitting on golden thrones, making noble speeches about honor and virtue. Hollywood loves this image, doesn't it? The righteous king, the moral leader, the protector of Christian values. But what if I told you that behind those castle walls, many of these same kings were running what we'd call today organized crime syndicates? Let me take you back to 12th century England, where King Henry II, yes, the same king from those romantic movies about Eleanor of Aquitaine, discovered something that would revolutionize royal finances forever. Henry wasn't just collecting taxes from farmers and merchants. According to historical records from the Pipe Rolls, which were essentially medieval government account books, Henry was collecting substantial revenues from something called stew houses. Now that sounds innocent enough, doesn't it? Like maybe there were just places that served good stew? Well, here's where it gets interesting. These stew houses were actually licensed brothels, and the king wasn't just allowing them, he was their business partner. The medieval chronicler Gerald of Wales wrote in his Topographia Hibernica that these establishments generated more revenue for some regions than agriculture itself. Can you imagine that? The world's oldest profession was literally funding kingdoms. But here's what makes this story even more fascinating, and this is where it gets almost comically absurd. These kings had to perform an incredible balancing act. During the day, they'd attend church services, kiss bishops' rings, and proclaim their devotion to Christian morality. But by nightfall, their treasury officials were counting coins that came directly from what the church considered the gravest of sins. Picture poor King John. You know, the villain from Robin Hood's stories sitting in his counting house, probably thinking, well, the Pope says this is sinful, but my army needs to eat, and these French wars aren't going to fund themselves. According to the Rotuli Charterum, John's government records, the crown was earning approximately £200 per year just from London's licensed establishments alone. To put that in perspective, that was enough to maintain a small army for months. And it wasn't just England. Across the Channel in France, Philip Augustus, who was supposedly leading the Third Crusade to fight for Christian values in the Holy Land, was simultaneously licensing and taxing similar establishments in Paris. The irony is almost too perfect, isn't it? Fighting holy wars with unholy money. But perhaps the most audacious example comes from the records of Edward III in 14th century England. This is the same king who founded the Order of the Garter, one of the most prestigious knightly orders in Europe, dedicated to chivalry and Christian virtue. Yet historian Ruth Marzo Carras, in her groundbreaking work Common Women, reveals that Edward's administration didn't just tax these businesses, they regulated them like any other trade guild. There were official licenses, health inspections, and even designated red light districts with royal approval. Think about the sheer boldness of this system. These weren't corrupt officials taking bribes under the table. This was official government policy written into law, recorded in official documents that survive to this day. The king's seal, the same seal that authenticated holy proclamations and religious endowments, was also used to license brothels. And here's a detail that always amazes me. According to the Liber Albus, a 15th century compilation of London's laws, these establishments had to follow strict business regulations. They couldn't operate on Sundays or holy days because apparently even sin needed to respect the Sabbath. They couldn't serve alcohol, presumably because drunk customers were bad for business. And get this, they had to close during parliamentary sessions because, well, we can't have lawmakers getting distracted, can we? But the most incredible part of this story isn't just that kings allowed prostitution, it's how they justified it. Royal advisors developed elaborate philosophical arguments about why this arrangement actually served the greater good. They claimed that regulated vice prevented worse crimes, that it protected virtuous women, and that it provided necessary revenue for defending the realm. Medieval political theorist Christine de Pizan actually wrote that these policies demonstrated wise governance rather than moral corruption. Can you imagine being a medieval peasant, struggling to pay your taxes, and then discovering that your hard-earned coins were competing with revenue from the local brothel to fund the king's wars? It's almost like discovering your strict religious principal was secretly running a casino on the side. As we dig deeper into this incredible historical rabbit hole, you might be wondering, how did this system actually work day to day? How did kings manage to keep their subjects, the church, and their own consciences satisfied while running what was essentially a government-sponsored vice industry? Well, that's exactly what we're going to explore next as we travel back to ancient Babylon, where this entire system first began, and where we'll discover that what medieval kings were doing was actually just a continuation of a practice that had been perfecting itself for over 3,000 years. So where did this whole idea actually begin? Well, buckle up, because we're about to travel back nearly 4,000 years to a place that would make Las Vegas look like a quiet Sunday school picnic. Welcome to ancient Babylon, where the world's first organized government-sanctioned sex industry wasn't just tolerated, it was considered sacred. Now, I know what you're thinking. Sacred prostitution? That sounds like something someone made up to justify bad behavior. But here's the thing, this wasn't some shadowy underworld operation. This was happening right inside the temples, with the full blessing of both gods and kings, and the economic impact was absolutely staggering. Picture this. You're walking through the gates of Babylon around 1750 BCE, during the reign of the famous King Hammurabi, yes, the same guy who gave us one of the first written law codes. The city is buzzing with merchants from across the known world, and right there, towering over everything else, is the magnificent Temple of Ishtar, the goddess of love and fertility. But this isn't just a place of worship, it's essentially the ancient world's most profitable business district. According to the historian Herodotus, writing in his histories around 450 BCE, every woman in Babylon was required to sit in the Temple of Aphrodite at least once in her lifetime and offer herself to a stranger for money. Now, modern scholars like Professor Stephanie Budin from Rutgers University have debated whether Herodotus was entirely accurate. But what's undisputed is that temple prostitution was a massive, organized industry that generated enormous wealth. And here's where it gets really interesting from an economic perspective. The Code of Hammurabi, those famous laws carved in stone that we can still read today, actually contains specific regulations about temple workers and their earnings. These weren't desperate people on the margins of society. Many of these women were highly educated, could read and write, and were essentially the ancient world's equivalent of high-end escort services. Dr. Julia Asante, in her groundbreaking research, Bad Girls and Kinky Boys, reveals that some of these temple women owned property, ran businesses, and wielded significant political influence. They were paying taxes directly to the royal treasury, and those taxes were funding everything from military campaigns to massive construction projects. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon? Built partly with revenue from the world's oldest profession. But here's what absolutely blows my mind about this system. It wasn't hidden or shameful. The Babylonian creation myth, the Enuma Elish, literally celebrates Ishtar's sexual power as essential to cosmic order. Imagine that, a civilization where sexuality wasn't something to be ashamed of, but was considered so important to social stability that it was written into their creation story. Now, you might be wondering, how exactly did this work as a business model? Well, the temple records from Sippar, dating to around 1600 BCE, show us incredible details. These institutions were essentially ancient corporations. They had hierarchical management structures, accounting systems, and even what we'd recognize today as franchising agreements with smaller temples throughout the kingdom. The economist Michael Hudson, in his work Sacred Economics, calculated that temple revenues in major Babylonian cities could represent up to 30% of total urban economic activity. 30%! That's like discovering that 1/3 of modern New York City's economy was based on a single industry that we barely acknowledge existed. And the international trade connections were mind-boggling. Cuneiform tablets from the ancient city of Canip show Babylonian temple networks extending all the way to Anatolia in modern-day Turkey. These weren't just local operations, they were international businesses with supply chains, quality control and brand recognition across the ancient Near East. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect was how they handled the religious economic contradiction that would later plague medieval European kings. The Babylonians solved this problem brilliantly. They made it a religious duty. According to the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's oldest surviving stories, the temple courtesan Shamhat literally civilizes the wild man Enkidu through sexuality. In Babylonian culture, this industry wasn't corrupting civilization, it was creating it. The Greek historian Strabo, writing in his geography around 20 CE, described visiting Babylon centuries later and being amazed by the economic sophistication of these temple complexes. He wrote that they functioned as banks, schools, libraries, and entertainment centers all rolled into one. They were basically ancient shopping malls, but with a very specialized anchor tenant. And here's something that always makes me chuckle. The Babylonians were incredibly bureaucratic about this. Clay tablets from the Nabu temple in Borsippa contain detailed employee schedules, customer complaint procedures, and even what appear to be performance reviews. Can you imagine getting a performance evaluation from a Babylonian temple administrator? Your devotional services have been satisfactory, but we need to work on your cuneiform handwriting. The scale of wealth generation was unprecedented for its time. According to calculations by economic historian Maurice Silver in his book, Taking Ancient Mythology Economically, the Temple of Marduk in Babylon alone may have generated annual revenues equivalent to feeding and housing over 10,000 people for a year. That's like a single business supporting the entire population of a major ancient city. But what really sets Babylon apart is how they innovated the customer experience. Archaeological evidence from the Ishtar Gate area suggests these temples offered not just sexual services, but complete lifestyle experiences. There were restaurants, baths, gardens, entertainment venues, and even what appear to be ancient spas. They invented the concept of luxury hospitality and it was so successful that the model spread throughout the ancient world. The influence extended far beyond economics. The Babylonian Talmud, compiled much later by Jewish scholars, contains extensive discussions about the temple system they encountered, and many of their commercial law principles actually derive from Babylonian temple business practices. These ancient establishments essentially created some of our earliest contract law, property rights, and even early forms of consumer protection. Now here's where the story takes an interesting turn. The Babylonians weren't content to keep this profitable model to themselves. Through trade networks and cultural exchange, their system began influencing civilizations across the ancient world. And nowhere did this influence take root more spectacularly than in the Roman Empire, where these ancient business principles would be transformed into something that would make Babylon's system look almost quaint by comparison. Because if you think Babylonian temple prostitution was sophisticated, wait until you see what the Romans did with it. They took Babylon's religious economic model and turned it into something that would make modern corporate executives weep with envy, a perfectly efficient, ruthlessly profitable machine that would fund the greatest empire the ancient world had ever seen. The Romans took one look at Babylon's ancient system and thought, "Hold my wine, we can do this better." And better might be the understatement of the millennium. What the Romans created wasn't just a business. It was an economic juggernaut that would make modern Fortune 500 companies look like neighborhood lemonade stands. Let me paint you a picture of just how massive this industry became. In the year 73 CE, during Emperor Vespasian's reign, Rome implemented what historians call the vectigal lex capturis, essentially a tax on prostitution. Now here's the kicker. According to the Roman historian Suetonius in his Lives of the 12 Caesars, this single tax generated enough revenue to fund the construction of the Colosseum. Yes, you heard that right. That iconic symbol of Roman engineering and entertainment, built with taxes from the world's oldest profession. But the Romans didn't stop there. Oh no, they were just getting started. The Corpus Inscriptionum Latinarum, that's basically Rome's massive collection of inscriptions and official records, reveals something absolutely mind-blowing. By the 1st century CE, there were over 45 different classifications of sex workers, each with their own tax rates, legal protections, and guild memberships. The Romans had basically created the ancient world's first comprehensive sex work taxonomy. Think about the bureaucratic precision required for this. Some nameless Roman administrator sat down and thought, "You know what this empire needs? A detailed categorization system for every possible type of intimate service, complete with standardized pricing and tax schedules." And then they actually did it. The level of organization is almost comically thorough. Now I want you to imagine walking through ancient Rome during its peak. You're strolling down the Suburra Rome's red light district, and according to the satirist Juvenal, writing in his satires around 100 CE, this neighborhood was generating more economic activity per square foot than the Forum Romanum itself. The Forum was where senators debated the fate of nations, but the Suburra? That's where they were actually funding those nations. The economic historian Walter Scheidel from Stanford University calculated that Rome's sex industry may have employed anywhere from 15,000 to 20,000 people in the city alone during the 1st and 2nd centuries. But here's what makes this number truly staggering. Rome's total population was only about 1 million people. That means roughly 2% of the entire city was working in this single industry. For comparison, that would be like having 70,000 people in modern New York City all working in the same profession. And the Romans, being Romans, turned everything into a competition. The graffiti preserved in Pompeii, that city frozen in time by Mount Vesuvius, contains what amount to ancient Yelp reviews. Professor Rebecca Benefiel from Washington and Lee University has documented over 100 inscriptions that are essentially customer testimonials. Euplia was here with Africanus, reads one. Myrtis, you do everything well, declares another. The Romans invented online reviews about 2,000 years before the internet existed. But here's where it gets really fascinating from a business perspective. The Romans created what we'd recognize today as a franchise system. According to the legal scholar Thomas McGinn in his definitive work, The Economy of Prostitution in the Roman World, there were standardized operating procedures, brand recognition across different cities, and even quality control measures enforced by local magistrates. The Digest of Justinian, basically ancient Rome's comprehensive legal code, contains incredibly detailed regulations about this industry. There were rules about advertising, customer safety, employee working conditions, and even dispute resolution procedures. The Romans had created what was essentially the ancient world's first heavily regulated service industry. And the profits? Oh, the profits were astronomical. The Roman tax records from Egypt, preserved on papyrus and housed in places like the British Museum, show that in the province of Egypt alone, revenues from this industry were funding approximately 15% of the regional military budget. 15%. That's like discovering that a single industry in modern California was directly paying for the entire state's highway system. But perhaps the most brilliant aspect of the Roman system was how they solved the moral contradiction that plagued other civilizations. The Romans simply separated legal status from economic activity. According to Tacitus in his Annals, certain classes of citizens were prohibited from engaging in this work, but freed slaves and foreigners could operate freely. It was basically economic apartheid with a profit motive. The scale of international operations was breathtaking. Archaeological evidence from Roman Britain shows standardized tokens and pricing systems identical to those found in Roman Spain, Roman Gaul, and Roman Africa. The historian Mary Beard notes in her book SPQR that Roman entrepreneurs had created what was essentially the ancient world's first multinational corporation, with consistent branding and services across 3 continents. And the customer base? Well, let's just say it included some very recognizable names. The historian Cassius Dio, writing in his Roman history, mentions that emperors like Caligula and Commodus didn't just patronize these establishments, they actually participated in the business side. Caligula allegedly turned part of his palace into a brothel and personally collected the fees. Talk about hands-on management. The technological innovations were remarkable too. Roman establishments pioneered what we now call customer relationship management. Lead tablets found in Roman Britain contain what appear to be customer preference records, ancient databases tracking individual client likes and dislikes. The Romans were doing market research and customer segmentation 2,000 years ago. But here's what really showcases Roman efficiency. They integrated this industry into their broader economic ecosystem. The Notitia Dignitatum, an official directory of the late Roman Empire, lists sex work establishments alongside bakeries, blacksmiths, and other essential services. They had normalized it to the point where it was just another part of the urban infrastructure. The numbers become even more impressive when you consider the multiplier effects. Professor Catherine Edwards from Birkbeck College calculated that for every denarius spent in these establishments, approximately 3 additional denarii circulated through related businesses: restaurants, baths, jewelry makers, perfume sellers, security services. The Romans had accidentally created one of history's most effective economic stimulus programs. Have you ever wondered how different our modern world might be if we approached complex social issues with that level of practical economics first thinking? The Romans weren't particularly concerned with the moral philosophy. They were concerned with what worked, what generated revenue, and what kept their massive empire functioning smoothly. As impressive as the Roman system was, though, it would eventually face its greatest challenge not from barbarian invasions or economic collapse, but from an entirely new force that was spreading throughout the empire, a radical religious movement that viewed sexuality itself as inherently problematic. And the collision between Roman pragmatism and Christian morality would create a tension that would reshape European civilization for the next 1,000 years, leading to the incredible contradictions we discovered among those medieval kings. When Christianity swept across the Roman Empire, you might expect it would have ended this entire system overnight. After all, here was a religion preaching sexual purity, moral restraint, and spiritual salvation over earthly pleasures. But here's where history gets deliciously complicated. Instead of ending the world's oldest profession, Christianity accidentally created the most hypocritical and profitable arrangement in medieval history. Imagine being a medieval king sitting in your throne room around the year 1200, with a bishop on one side telling you that prostitution is a mortal sin, and your treasurer on the other side explaining that shutting down the local brothels would bankrupt your kingdom. What would you choose? Salvation or solvency? Well, according to the financial records preserved in the English National Archives, most kings chose both, and the mental gymnastics they performed to justify this decision would make Olympic contortionists jealous. The story begins with St. Augustine of Hippo, writing in his City of God around 410 CE. Now, Augustine was no fan of sexual indulgence, but he made one crucial admission that would echo through medieval theology for centuries. "Remove prostitutes from human affairs," he wrote, "and you will unsettle everything on account of lusts." In other words, even this champion of Christian morality acknowledged that completely eliminating the sex trade might cause bigger social problems. Medieval theologians seized on this idea and ran with it. Thomas Aquinas, perhaps the most influential philosopher of the Middle Ages, expanded on Augustine's reasoning in his Summa Theologica around 1270. Aquinas argued that tolerating prostitution was like tolerating sewers in a city unpleasant but necessary to prevent worse corruption. It was the lesser evil doctrine, and it gave kings exactly the theological wiggle room they needed. But here's where it gets really interesting. The church wasn't just tolerating this arrangement in many cases, it was actively participating in the profits. The medieval historian Jacques Le Goff documented in his work Medieval Civilization that numerous monasteries and cathedral chapters across Europe were landlords to red light districts. They weren't running the businesses directly, but they were collecting rent from the buildings where the businesses operated. Picture this bizarre scene. Monks praying in their chapel upstairs while collecting rent money from the brothel downstairs. The cognitive dissonance must have been extraordinary. But the monastery of Saint-Denis near Paris, according to records from the Cartulaire de Notre-Dame de Paris, was earning substantial annual revenues from properties leased to what they euphemistically called women of hospitality. The justification system became incredibly sophisticated. Medieval canon lawyers, yes, the church had lawyers even then, developed elaborate theories about how this arrangement actually served Christian purposes. According to the Decretum Gratiani, compiled around 1140, regulated prostitution, protected virtuous women from rape, prevented adultery among married men, and provided a path for fallen women to earn money for eventual redemption. It was basically theological venture capitalism. Invest in sin now for spiritual dividends later. King Louis IX of France St. Louis, who was literally canonized by the church, provides us with a perfect example of this contradiction in action. In 1254, Louis issued an ordinance trying to ban prostitution entirely because he wanted to be a good Christian king. But according to the chronicler Matthew Paris in his Chronica Majora, within 2 years, Louis was forced to reverse course. Why? Because his treasury was hemorrhaging money, crime rates were skyrocketing, and his nobles were threatening rebellion. So Louis came up with what can only be described as a masterpiece of medieval compromise. He moved all the brothels outside the city walls, imposed heavy licensing fees, and donated a portion of the profits to building churches. Problem solved. He could claim moral victory while maintaining financial stability. The historian Caroline Walker Bynum notes in Holy Feast and Holy Fast that Louis even convinced the Pope that this arrangement demonstrated his commitment to both temporal governance and spiritual leadership. The English approach was even more brazen. Henry II, who we met earlier, didn't just license these establishments, he created an entire bureaucracy to manage them. The Liber Customarum, a collection of London's medieval customs, reveals that the city had official positions including a steward of the stews, complete with ceremonial robes and an annual salary paid from brothel fees. Can you imagine having that job title on your medieval LinkedIn profile? But perhaps the most audacious example comes from the Papal States themselves. Pope Sixtus IV, the same pope who commissioned the Sistine Chapel, issued a papal bull in 1471 that essentially legalized and taxed prostitution in Rome. According to the Vatican Secret Archives, documented by historian Eamon Duffy in Saints and Sinners, the papal treasury was earning over 20,000 ducats annually from licensing fees by the end of the 15th century. Think about that for a moment. The same institution that preached celibacy for its priests was collecting taxes from sex workers. The same treasury that funded magnificent works of religious art was also funding those works with profits from activities the church officially condemned. The system became so institutionalized that different regions developed their own unique approaches to managing the moral economic contradiction. In Germanic territories, according to Ruth Marzo-Karras in Common Women, brothel keepers were required to attend Mass every Sunday and donate a percentage of profits to the poor. In French territories, sex workers had to wear distinctive clothing to maintain moral boundaries while operating with legal protection. The most fascinating innovation was the development of what historians call temporal morality. The idea was that sins committed for the greater good of society, like maintaining royal revenues to fund crusades against infidels, were somehow less sinful than personal indulgences. Medieval theologians actually developed point systems for different types of moral transgressions, like some bizarre spiritual accounting system. And the intellectual contortions required to maintain this system, they were Olympic level. The medieval chronicler Gerald of Wales wrote extensively about how King John of England would attend morning mass, receive communion, and then spend his afternoons reviewing tax receipts from London Southwark stews. John's court chaplains developed elaborate prayers asking God to bless the king's efforts to regulate sin for the prevention of greater evils. Can you imagine being one of those chaplains? Dear Lord, please bless our king as he manages his prostitution licensing program for the good of the realm. The theological creativity required must have been exhausting. But here's what makes this period so crucial to our story. This wasn't just hypocrisy, it was innovation. Medieval Europe was essentially developing the world's first comprehensive regulatory framework for managing moral contradictions in governance. They were pioneering concepts that we still struggle with today. Harm reduction, pragmatic policymaking, and the separation of personal morality from public administration. The success of these medieval compromise systems would inspire even more audacious innovations during the Renaissance, when Italian city-states would take everything we've discussed so far and transform it into something that would make medieval kings look like amateurs. Because while medieval rulers were trying to balance morality with necessity, Renaissance entrepreneurs were about to discover that when you remove moral qualms entirely, the profit potential becomes absolutely limitless. If you thought medieval kings were creative, wait until you meet the Venetians. These Renaissance entrepreneurs looked at 1,000 years of religious economic compromise and said, "That's cute. Watch this." What they created in the floating city of Venice wasn't just a business. It was a complete reimagining of how pleasure, politics, and profit could work together. Venice in the 15th century was unlike anywhere else on Earth. Built on water, governed by merchants, and positioned at the crossroads between East and West, it was a city that lived by one rule. If it made money, it was probably a good idea. And nowhere was this philosophy more brilliantly applied than in their approach to the world's oldest profession. Here's what makes Venice absolutely unique. They turned sex work into high art. I'm not speaking metaphorically, I mean literally. According to the art historian Paul Holberton in his work of Virgins and Courtesans, many of Venice's most celebrated Renaissance paintings weren't depicting mythological goddesses or religious figures. They were essentially high-end advertising for the city's most exclusive courtesans. Titian's famous Venus of Urbino? Modern scholars like Rona Goffin argue it was likely a portrait of a courtesan named Angela del Moro. Giorgione's mysterious sleeping Venus? Probably another courtesan portrait. The Venetians had basically invented the world's first luxury lifestyle marketing, where great artists created masterpieces that doubled as upscale escort advertisements. But the real innovation wasn't artistic, it was logistical. Venice solved a problem that had plagued every other civilization. How do you run a large-scale pleasure industry in a densely populated city without causing social disruption? Their answer was brilliant in its simplicity. Put it on boats. The Venetian state archives contain records from the Consiglio dei Dieci Venice's powerful ruling council detailing regulations for what they called case galleggianti, floating houses. These weren't just brothels on barges, they were floating luxury resorts. According to diplomatic reports from the Florentine ambassador Vespasiano da Bisticci, some of these vessels were so elaborate that they rivaled the palaces of minor Italian princes. Picture this. You're a wealthy merchant from Constantinople, arriving in Venice after a long trading voyage. Instead of stumbling around dark medieval alleyways, you're invited aboard a beautifully appointed floating palazzo, complete with silk curtains, fine wines, professional musicians, and women who could discuss philosophy in 3 languages. The Venetians had reinvented hospitality itself. The economic impact was staggering. The historian Frederick Lane, in his definitive Venice, a maritime republic, calculated that by 1500, Venice's pleasure industry was generating approximately 10% of the city's total commercial revenue. 10%. That's like discovering that tourism in modern Las Vegas was being driven entirely by a single type of business. And the international clientele? Well, it read like a who's who of Renaissance Europe. The diary of Marino Sanudo, a Venetian chronicler, mentions that these floating establishments regularly hosted German bankers, French nobles, Ottoman diplomats, and even papal legates. Venice had created the world's first truly international pleasure destination. But here's where Venice gets really innovative. They created the world's first celebrity courtesan culture. These weren't anonymous sex workers, they were Renaissance influencers. Women like Veronica Franco and Tullia d'Aragona weren't just beautiful, they were published poets, political commentators, and social celebrities. Veronica Franco's story is particularly fascinating. According to her surviving letters collected in Letters from a Courtesan by Margaret Rosenthal, Franco was charging fees equivalent to what a skilled craftsman made in 6 months. But she wasn't just selling her body, she was selling access to Venice's intellectual and political elite. She hosted salons where merchants made deals, diplomats exchanged information, and artists found patrons. Franco's tax records, preserved in the Venetian state archives, show she owned multiple properties, employed a staff of servants, and was lending money to nobility. She had essentially become a Renaissance venture capitalist whose initial capital happened to be her sexuality. Talk about leveraging your assets. The Venetian system was so sophisticated that they developed what we'd recognize today as market segmentation. According to the research of historian Guido Ruggiero in The Boundaries of Eros, there were at least 7 distinct categories of pleasure services, each targeting different economic classes and offering different experiences. At the bottom were the simple boat operators working the canals. Think of them as the ancient equivalent of taxi drivers with benefits. At the top were women like Franco, who were essentially running multimedia entertainment companies. They offered poetry readings, musical performances, intellectual salons, and political networking opportunities, with intimate services being just one part of a complete luxury experience. The pricing strategies were incredibly sophisticated too. The Libro d'Oro, Venice's register of noble families, contains references to subscription services, seasonal packages, and what appear to be early loyalty programs. Some courtesans offered annual contracts to wealthy merchants, providing guaranteed availability during important trading seasons, and the quality control, the Venetians approached it with the same attention to detail they applied to their famous glassmaking. The guild regulations, preserved in the Archivio di Stato, required regular health inspections, language proficiency tests for higher-tier workers, and even customer satisfaction surveys. Venice was running the ancient world's first ISO-certified pleasure industry. The diplomatic implications were huge. Foreign ambassadors' expense reports, found in archives from Florence to Vienna, show substantial budgets allocated specifically for Venetian hospitality. The city had essentially turned pleasure into soft power, using these floating establishments to gather intelligence, influence foreign policy, and secure favourable trade agreements. But perhaps the most brilliant aspect was how Venice solved the moral problem that had tormented medieval rulers. They simply redefined the entire industry as cultural ambassadorship. According to the writings of Pietro Bembo, a Venetian cardinal and scholar, the city's courtesans weren't selling sex, they were selling the Venetian experience to international visitors. It was basically ancient branding and marketing. The success was so complete that other Italian cities-states tried to copy the model. But none could replicate Venice's unique combination of factors. The physical isolation provided by water, the international trading networks, the concentration of wealth, and perhaps most importantly, the Venetian pragmatic attitude toward profit over propriety. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to live in a society that approached complex social issues with such pure entrepreneurial creativity? The Venetians looked at a problem that had caused centuries of moral hand-wringing and simply asked, how can we make this work better for everyone involved? Their success would soon inspire imitators across Europe, but none would be more audacious than the monarchs of England, who would take Venetian innovation and combine it with medieval taxation systems to create something that would shock even the worldly Venetians. Because while Venice had perfected the art of elegant discretion, the English kings were about to discover that when it came to profiting from vice, sometimes the direct approach worked even better. While the Venetians were perfecting elegance and discretion across the English Channel, King Henry VIII was taking a completely different approach. Henry looked at the sophisticated Venetian model and essentially said, "That's nice, but I prefer the direct method." What he created in London's Southwark district wasn't just legally sanctioned prostitution, It was the medieval equivalent of a government-run casino. Now, when most people think of Henry VIII, they picture the wife-killing tyrant obsessed with producing a male heir. But here's what your history textbook probably didn't mention. Henry was also one of the most successful vice entrepreneurs in European history. And the numbers? They're absolutely mind-boggling. The story begins in 1506, when Henry was still just Prince Henry, watching his father Henry VII manage what were called the Suffolk stews. These weren't bathhouses, despite the name. They were England's first fully regulated, government-licensed brothel district. According to the calendar of patent rolls housed in the National Archives, Henry VII was earning approximately £2,000 annually from licensing fees alone. To put that in perspective, that was enough money to maintain a fleet of warships, but young Henry wasn't content with his father's modest approach. When he became king in 1509, according to the court records documented by historian Alison Weir, in Henry VIII, the King and his court, one of his first acts was to completely reorganise the Southwark operation. He didn't shut it down, he optimised it. Henry created what can only be described as the world's first comprehensive sex industry regulatory framework. The Liber Albus London's medieval legal code contains Henry's detailed regulations covering everything from building specifications to employee health requirements to customer complaint procedures. Reading these documents today is like discovering that a medieval king had essentially created the ancient equivalent of a department of adult entertainment. The level of bureaucratic detail is almost comical. Henry's regulations specified the minimum room sizes, the quality of bed linens, the types of food that could be served, and even the musical instruments that could be played for entertainment. According to the research of historian Ruth Mazo-Karras, Henry was micromanaging the customer experience with the same attention to detail he applied to planning military campaigns. But here's where it gets really interesting. Henry didn't just tax these establishments, he essentially became their business partner. The royal accounts, preserved in the Exchequer rolls, show that by 1520 the Crown was taking a percentage of gross revenues, collecting licensing fees, charging rent for the buildings, and even selling exclusive operating permits for different neighbourhoods. Henry had basically invented the franchise business model 500 years before McDonald's. The financial impact was extraordinary. According to calculations by economic historian Christopher Dyer in Standards of Living in the later Middle Ages, Henry's Southwark revenues were generating enough income to fund approximately 15% of the Royal Navy's annual operating costs. The same king who built England into a naval superpower was partially financing that fleet with profits from prostitution. And Henry being Henry, he couldn't resist adding his own theatrical flair to the operation. The court records describe elaborate licensing ceremonies where new brothel keepers would kneel before royal officials and swear oaths of loyalty, not just to the king, but to maintaining standards worthy of His Majesty's subjects. Can you imagine that scene? I solemnly swear to run an establishment that would make the king proud. The international implications were huge. Foreign ambassadors' reports, preserved in archives from the Vatican to the Habsburg court, describe their amazement at the openness and organisation of Henry's system. The Spanish ambassador wrote to Emperor Charles V that London's red light district was more efficiently managed than most royal palaces. That's either a compliment to Henry's organisational skills or a serious insult to royal housekeeping standards. But perhaps the most brilliant aspect of Henry's approach was how he handled the religious opposition. Remember, this was the same king who would later break with Rome and create the Church of England. Henry's solution to clerical complaints about his vice policies was characteristically direct. He simply appointed bishops who agreed with his economic priorities. According to the letters of Thomas Cranmer, Henry's Archbishop of Canterbury, The king's position was that a well-regulated vice industry prevents greater social disorders and provides revenue for defending Christendom against infidels. It was basically the same theological argument we heard from medieval kings, but delivered with Henry's typical bluntness. The operational statistics are fascinating. The Southwark court rolls, analysed by a historian Carlin Barton, show that by 1530, the district was employing over 2,000 people directly, with perhaps another 8,000 working in supporting businesses, taverns, musicians, security, laundry, food service, and what we'd now call hospitality management. Henry had created one of London's largest employment sectors, and the quality control system, it was remarkably sophisticated. Henry established regular inspection schedules, customer feedback mechanisms, and even what appears to be the world's first professional development program for sex workers. The guild regulations required literacy training, basic accounting skills, and instruction in what were euphemistically called customer relations. The pricing structure was incredibly detailed. Different services had standardized rates. There were seasonal adjustments for holidays and festivals, and bulk discounts for wealthy merchants who could afford extended stays. Henry's administrators had essentially created the ancient world's first comprehensive pricing algorithm. But here's what really showcases Henry's business acumen. He integrated the Southwark operation into England's broader economic strategy. Foreign merchants conducting business in London received official recommendations for hospitality services. Diplomatic visitors were provided with guided tours of the district, and international trade negotiations sometimes actually took place in upscale work establishments. Henry had turned prostitution into economic diplomacy. The system was so successful that other European monarchs sent observers to study Henry's model. The French court's reports, documented by historian Barbara Tuchman, describe detailed analyses of Henry's regulatory framework, taxation methods, and integration strategies. Henry wasn't just running brothels, he was exporting expertise in vice management. The most incredible aspect, though, was how Henry handled public relations. Rather than hiding this revenue source, he was remarkably transparent about it. The royal accounts were public documents, and anyone could see exactly how much money the crown was earning from Southwark. Henry's attitude seemed to be, if you're going to profit from vice, own it completely. This openness created an interesting social dynamic. According to the diary entries of contemporary London citizens, documented by historian Ian Mortimer in The Time Traveller's Guide to Medieval England, many Londoners were actually proud of their king's pragmatic approach. They saw it as evidence that England was more modern and efficient than other European kingdoms. Can you imagine living in a society where your monarch's business savvy was measured partly by how well he managed the local red light district? The sheer audacity of Henry's approach was breathtaking. But Henry's success would eventually inspire even more ambitious projects across the continent. Because while the English king had perfected the art of direct government involvement in vice industries, the Dutch were watching closely and developing ideas that would make Henry's operation look almost conservative. They were about to create something that would revolutionize not just the sex trade, but the entire concept of urban planning and social engineering. The Dutch looked at Henry VIII's straightforward approach and thought, interesting, but what if we made this permanent? What emerged in Amsterdam during the 17th century wasn't just another red light district, it was humanity's first attempt to completely integrate sex work into the fabric of urban civilization, and the results would influence city planning for the next 400 years. Amsterdam in the 1600s was the richest city in the world. The Dutch East India Company was generating profits that would make modern tech giants weep with envy, and all that wealth was flowing through Amsterdam's canals. But here's what's remarkable. Instead of trying to hide their vice industry like other cities, the Dutch decided to make it a permanent visible part of their urban landscape. The Stadsarchief. Amsterdam. The city's official archives contains the original city planning documents from 1650 that designated specific canal-side buildings for what they diplomatically called hospitality services. But these weren't hidden in back alleys or pushed to the city's outskirts. They were built right into the heart of the merchant district, with the same architectural standards as banks and guild halls. Think about the audacity of that decision. The Dutch were essentially saying, "Kom zo, this is part of who we are as a commercial society, so let's do it properly." According to the urban planning historian Reinier Salverde, in his work The Golden Age of Amsterdam, this was the first time in European history that sex work was treated as legitimate urban infrastructure, like markets or harbours. The economic integration was breathtaking. The merchant guild records, analysed by historian Jonathan Israel in Dutch Primacy and World Trade, show that by 1670, Amsterdam's red light establishments were formally incorporated into the city's commercial tax base, contributing roughly % of total municipal revenues. But more importantly, they were generating what economists call multiplier effects throughout the entire urban economy. Here's how it worked. International merchants arriving in Amsterdam weren't just spending money on these services, they were extending their business trips, making larger purchases, and bringing more colleagues on the future visits. The Dutch had accidentally invented what we now call destination marketing, using adult entertainment as an economic catalyst for broader commercial activity. The quality standards were revolutionary. According to the Resolutie van de Vroedschap Amsterdam City Council minutes, the regulations required not just health inspections and business licensing, but also architectural standards, interior design guidelines, and customer service training. The Dutch were applying the same meticulous attention to detail they used for cheese-making and shipbuilding. But here's what makes Amsterdam's approach truly unique. They solved the moral contradiction that had plagued other societies by essentially redefining morality itself. The Dutch Reformed Church, according to historian Willem Vrijhoff in Embodied Belief, developed what they called commercial Calvinism, the idea that any economic activity that contributed to societal prosperity was inherently moral, regardless of traditional religious prohibitions. This wasn't just theological hair-splitting. The Amsterdam City Council actually invited church leaders to participate in designing the regulatory framework. Pastor Johannes Kokkeus, one of the leading Reformed theologians of time, wrote extensively about how well-regulated vice industries prevented greater social disorders while generating resources for charitable works. They had turned sin into stewardship. The international impact was immediate. Diplomatic correspondence from the French, English, and German courts preserved in various European archives describes a kind of shocked admiration for Dutch pragmatism. The Venetian ambassador wrote to the Doge that Amsterdam's approach made Venice's floating brothels look quaint and inefficient by comparison. But the real innovation was in data collection. The Dutch, being Dutch, kept incredibly detailed statistics about everything. The Archief van de Burgemeesters contains quarterly reports tracking customer demographics, seasonal revenue patterns, employee satisfaction surveys, and even what appear to be early market research studies about customer preferences. This data-driven approach led to continuous system improvements. When the record showed that certain neighbourhoods were experiencing social tensions, the city would relocate establishments. When customer surveys indicated service quality issues, they would modify training requirements. The Dutch had created the world's first evidence-based vice policy. The architectural legacy is still visible today. Those iconic Amsterdam windows with red lighting, that design wasn't accidental, It was the result of careful urban planning studies. According to a research by architectural historian Cor Wagenaar in Town Planning in the Netherlands, the Dutch determined that street-level window displays created better customer-worker interactions than the hidden brothel model used elsewhere in Europe. The employee protections were centuries ahead of their time. Guild records show that workers had collective bargaining rights, healthcare benefits, retirement savings programs, and legal protection against customer abuse. The Dutch had essentially created the world's first unionized sex work industry, and the tax integration was brilliant. Rather than imposing special vice taxes like other countries, Amsterdam simply included these businesses in their standard commercial tax system. According to economist Jan de Vries in The Dutch Rural Economy, this normalization approach generated more reliable revenue than the punitive taxation models used elsewhere. The success attracted international attention and imitation attempts. The Gazette de France reported in 1675 that King Louis XIV had sent officials to study the Amsterdam model, though they concluded it would be incompatible with French Catholic sensibilities. And the English Parliament commissioned a similar study documented in the parliamentary papers, but ultimately deemed the Dutch approach too radical for English society. What's fascinating is how the Dutch system influenced their broader approach to social policy. The same pragmatic, data-driven methodology they developed for managing sex work was later applied to poverty relief, public health, and education. Amsterdam had essentially pioneered evidence-based governance. The durability of the system is perhaps its most impressive feature. While other European red light districts rose and fell with changing moral fashions and political pressures, Amsterdam's approach proved remarkably stable. The basic regulatory framework established in the 1650s remained largely intact for over 2 centuries. But as successful as the Dutch model was in creating urban stability and economic prosperity, it would soon face a test from an unexpected direction. Because while Amsterdam was perfecting the art of practical governance, across the Channel the French aristocracy was discovering that when you combine unlimited royal wealth with complete moral flexibility, the possibilities become truly spectacular and scandalous. Just when you thought the story couldn't get more outrageous, enter the French aristocracy. If Amsterdam represented pragmatic capitalism, the French court represented something entirely different. What happens when absolute power meets absolute decadence, and when even queens discover that vice can be surprisingly profitable? The court of Louis XIV at Versailles wasn't just the centre of European politics, according to the documents in the Archives Nationales. It was also running what might have been history's most exclusive and expensive escort service. But this wasn't some secret operation hidden in palace basements. This was happening right out in the open, with the full knowledge and participation of some of the most powerful women in Europe. Let me introduce you to Françoise Athénaïs de Rochechouart, better known as Madame de Montespan, Louis XIV's most famous mistress. But here's what most people don't know. According to the memoirs of the Duc de Saint-Simon, one of the most reliable chroniclers of court life, Montespan wasn't just the king's lover. She was also running what amounted to a high-end matchmaking and entertainment service for the French nobility. The Correspondance de Madame de Maintenon reveals that Montespan had created an entire network of beautiful, educated women who provided companionship services to visiting diplomats, wealthy merchants, and foreign nobility. But these weren't street-level sex workers. These were daughters of minor nobility, educated in music, literature, and languages, who were essentially functioning as diplomatic hostesses with benefits. And here's the kicker. The profits from these arrangements weren't going to some shadowy criminal organization. They were going directly into the accounts of some of the highest-ranking women at Versailles. According to the financial records analysed by historian Simon Schammer in Citizens, several duchesses and countesses were earning more from these side businesses than from their official court stipends. But the most shocking revelation comes from the secret correspondence of Marie Antoinette herself, preserved in the Austrian state archives. Letters between the Queen and her mother, Empress Maria Theresa, reveal that Marie Antoinette was not only aware of these activities, but was actually taking a percentage of the profits to fund her legendary shopping habits and gambling debts. Can you imagine that? The same queen who supposedly said, "Let them eat cake," was apparently saying, "Let them pay for companionship to balance her personal budget." The irony is almost too perfect. The scale of these operations was staggering. According to the Memoirs Secrets compiled by Louis Petit de Bachaumont, by the 1780s, the French court's hospitality services were generating enough revenue to fund several regiments' worth of military expenses. The same court that was supposedly bankrupting France through extravagance was actually running a profitable side business. The client list read like a who's who of European power. Diplomatic dispatches from the Prussian, Austrian and English archives describe substantial budgets allocated specifically for French court entertainment expenses. Foreign ambassadors were essentially filing official expense reports for what we'd now call escort services, and their governments were approving these expenditures as necessary diplomatic costs. But perhaps the most audacious example involves the Comtesse du Barry, Louis XV's final official mistress. According to historian Christine Pevitt-Algant in Madame de Pompadour, du Barry didn't just provide personal services to the king, she essentially ran a recruitment and training program that supplied the entire European aristocratic network. Du Barry's operation was incredibly sophisticated. She maintained what amounted to a finishing school for young women from impoverished noble families, providing them with education, wardrobe and social connections. But the graduation ceremony, so to speak, involved placement in arrangements with wealthy clients across Europe. It was like a combination of charm school and employment agency. The financial records from the Archives de la Bastille show that du Barry was earning approximately 200,000 livres annually from these arrangements, enough to purchase entire estates. But more remarkably, she was also providing what we'd now recognize as social mobility services. Many of the women in her network used their earnings and connections to marry into higher social ranks or establish independent businesses. The quality control was extraordinary. According to the court protocols documented by historian William Doyle in the Oxford History of the French Revolution, there were elaborate screening procedures, educational requirements, and ongoing performance evaluations. The French aristocracy was applying the same attention to detail they used for managing their estates and diplomatic negotiations. And the international networking was brilliant. The correspondence between French court ladies and their counterparts in Vienna, London and Madrid shows a kind of informal diplomatic exchange program. Aristocratic women were essentially conducting parallel foreign relations through these personal service networks. But here's what makes the French system particularly fascinating. Unlike other countries where these activities were run by men, in France, women were the primary organisers and profit-takers. According to feminist historian Joan Landes in Women and the Public Sphere, the French court represented one of the few places in 18th century Europe where women exercised significant economic power, independent of their husbands or fathers. The cultural impact was enormous. The salon culture that made France the intellectual centre of Europe was partly funded through these activities. Women like Madame Geoffrin and Julie de Lespinasse were using profits from their hospitality services to sponsor philosophers, artists and writers. The French Enlightenment was literally being funded by the world's oldest profession. The political implications were huge too. According to diplomatic historian Derek Beals in Joseph II, many of the major European political negotiations of the 18th century took place not in formal diplomatic meetings, but in the private salons of these entrepreneurial French noblewomen. They were conducting shadow diplomacy while running profitable businesses. The system was so successful that it influenced French colonial policies. Documents from the Archives des Colonies show that the French government was deliberately recruiting women for colonial service using the same networks developed at Versailles. They had essentially created an export industry for French feminine sophistication. But this glittering system of aristocratic entrepreneurship was about to collide with the harsh realities of economic collapse and political revolution. And the collision would reveal just how deeply these activities had become embedded in the fabric of French society, and how their sudden disruption would contribute to one of history's most dramatic political upheavals. Throughout all these centuries of royal profits and aristocratic entrepreneurship, there's one pattern that emerges with almost mathematical precision. Every single attempt to completely ban prostitution failed spectacularly. And I mean spectacularly. The historical record shows us something that modern policymakers are still struggling to understand. Prohibition doesn't eliminate vice, it just makes it more expensive and more dangerous. Let's start with one of history's most dramatic examples, the Puritan Commonwealth under Oliver Cromwell in 1650s England. Cromwell looked at Henry VIII's profitable Southwark system and declared it an abomination that had to be destroyed immediately. According to the Acts and Ordinances of the Interregnum, Cromwell's government imposed death penalties for adultery and severe punishments for any form of commercialized sexuality. The results? Well, according to the diary of Samuel Pepys and contemporary court records analysed by historian Christopher Hill in The World Turned Upside Down, within 6 months of the ban, London's underground sex trade had tripled in size, prices had increased by over 400%, and violent crimes related to the industry had skyrocketed. But here's the really fascinating part. Cromwell's own financial records preserved in the National Archives show that by 1655, the government was spending more money trying to enforce the prohibition than Henry VIII had ever earned from licensing the industry. They had turned a profitable, regulated business into an expensive law enforcement nightmare. The economic logic behind this failure is actually quite simple, and it applies to every prohibition attempt throughout history. When you criminalize a service that people clearly want, you don't eliminate demand, you just drive up prices and create profit opportunities for people willing to take legal risks. It's basic supply and demand economics, but with guns and jail cells. Take the case of Pope Pius V's attempt to clean up Rome in 1566. According to Vatican historian Eamon Duffy in Saints and Sinners, Pius issued papal bulls banning all prostitution from the papal states and threatening excommunication for anyone involved. The Pope genuinely believed he could create a morally pure Christian society through the power of law. The results were catastrophic. Within a year, according to records from the Archivio Segreto Vaticano, Rome was experiencing unprecedented levels of sexual violence. Underground brothels were operating in church basements, and corrupt officials were making fortunes from bribes and protection money. The city had gone from having a regulated, taxable industry to having an uncontrolled criminal enterprise. Even more remarkably, the papal treasury's income plummeted so dramatically that Pius was forced to raise taxes on everything else to compensate for the lost vice revenues. The Pope had literally made his subjects poorer in the name of making them more virtuous. The pattern repeats everywhere you look in history. In 1254, King Louis IX of France St. Louis, tried his prohibition experiment. According to the chronicler Jean de Joinville's Life of St. Louis, within months, French cities were reporting massive increases in rape, adultery scandals among the nobility, and the emergence of unregulated criminal networks that were far more dangerous than the licensed establishments they replaced. But perhaps the most revealing case study comes from the Byzantine Empire under Emperor Leo VI around 900 CE. Leo's legal code, the Basilica, attempted to completely eliminate commercial sexuality from Constantinople. The historian Warren Treadgold, in A History of the Byzantine State and Society, documents the fascinating economic data from this experiment. Before the ban, Constantinople's licensed establishments were generating approximately 50,000 gold solidi annually in taxes, enough to maintain several military units. After the ban, the government was spending over 100,000 solidi annually on enforcement, while black market prices drove the industry's total economic value to nearly 300,000 solidi. They had tripled the industry's size while eliminating all government benefits. The most interesting aspect is how these prohibition experiments affected other parts of the economy. The English economic historian Michael Anderson, in Population Change in Northwestern Europe, noted that cities with vice prohibitions consistently showed decreased commercial activity, reduced foreign merchant visits, and declining tax revenues from legitimate businesses. It turns out that when you eliminate a major entertainment industry from a city, you don't just lose that specific revenue, you lose all the ancillary economic activity it generated. Hotels, restaurants, entertainment venues, luxury goods, merchants, and even basic services like laundries and barbers would see their business decline. The administrative costs were enormous too. According to records from various European archives, prohibition enforcement required creating entirely new categories of law enforcement, legal procedures, and administrative bureaucracy. Cities that had been profiting from vice licensing suddenly found themselves spending fortunes on vice squads, special courts, and expanded prison systems. And the corruption. Oh, the corruption was legendary. When you criminalize a lucrative industry, you create massive incentive structures for official corruption. The Chronicles of Froissart describe how Prohibition-era officials would routinely take bribes that exceeded their annual salaries, creating shadow governments funded by the very activities they were supposed to be eliminating. The health and safety impacts were consistently disastrous. Dr. Ruth Marzo-Karas's research in Common Women shows that prohibition periods invariably led to increased violence against sex workers, higher rates of sexually transmitted diseases, and worse working conditions. When an industry moves underground, worker protection disappears entirely. But here's what's really remarkable. In every single case, the prohibitions were eventually reversed. Not because of moral changes or religious evolution, but because of simple economic necessity. Governments discovered they couldn't afford the enforcement costs while simultaneously losing the tax revenues. The reversal patterns are almost comically predictable. First, authorities would quietly stop enforcing the laws. Then they'd create tolerance zones where enforcement was selectively ignored. Finally, they'd implement new licensing systems that were essentially identical to whatever system they'd previously banned. Have you ever noticed how this same pattern appears in modern debates about drug policy, gambling regulations, or even alcohol sales? The economic forces that made prohibition impossible in medieval times are exactly the same forces operating today. What's fascinating is how some rulers learned from these repeated failures and developed more sophisticated approaches. Instead of prohibition, they began experimenting with what we'd now call harm reduction policies, heavy regulation, high taxes, restricted locations, and mandatory health safety standards. But the most innovative responses would come during periods of genuine crisis, when governments desperately needed revenue and couldn't afford the luxury of moral prohibition. And nowhere was this dynamic more dramatically illustrated than during the Great Plagues that swept through Europe, when kings discovered that survival trumped morality every single time. When the Black Death swept through Europe in the 14th century, killing up to 60% of the population in some regions, you might expect that surviving authorities would focus on prayer, charity, and moral purification. Instead, many rulers made a discovery that would reshape their understanding of governance forever. In times of genuine crisis, vice industries weren't luxuries to be eliminated. They were essential infrastructure for survival. The plague years created what historians call a crisis economy, where normal social rules broke down and pragmatic survival took precedence over moral ideals. And in this environment, something remarkable happened. Sex work transformed from a controversial but profitable side business into a crucial component of epidemic management and economic recovery. Let me take you to Florence in 1348, right in the heart of the Black Death. According to the accounts of Giovanni Boccaccio in his Decameron, the city was losing hundreds of people daily, trade had collapsed, and social order was disintegrating. But here's what Boccaccio doesn't mention in his famous tales. Florence's city council made a shocking decision that probably saved the city from complete collapse. The Archivio di Stato di Firenze contains emergency ordinances from 1348 showing that Florence's government didn't just maintain their licensed establishments during the plague, they expanded them dramatically. Why? Because they discovered that these venues were among the few businesses still generating reliable tax revenue, while most other industries had shut down entirely. But the reasoning went deeper than just money. According to the physician's reports compiled by historian William Nafee in Sex Crimes, city authorities realized that maintaining recreational venues helped prevent social unrest among the surviving population. People facing potential death needed psychological outlets, and providing legal, regulated options prevented the kind of social breakdown that destroyed other plague-stricken cities. The economic logic was brutal but effective. Florence's treasurer records, analysed by historian Jean Brucker in Renaissance Florence, show that during 1348 to 1349, vice taxes represented nearly 25% of the city's total revenue. Without that income, Florence couldn't have maintained basic services, paid city guards, or funded the medical responses that eventually helped control the epidemic. The pattern repeated across plague-affected Europe with remarkable consistency. In Paris, according to the Journal d'un Bourgeois de Paris, the royal government not only maintained existing establishments, but actually created new ones specifically to serve the increased population of widows, orphans, and displaced people who needed income sources. The French approach was particularly innovative. Rather than viewing these businesses as morally problematic, plague-era administrators began treating them as essential social services. The Comptes du Domaine show that the royal treasury was providing what amounted to small business loans to help women establish independent operations, treating them like any other economic relief program. But perhaps the most fascinating example comes from England during the 100 Years' War. King Edward III was fighting an incredibly expensive military campaign against France, while simultaneously dealing with recurring plague outbreaks at home. According to military historian Michael Prestwich in Edward I, Edward made a decision that would seem shocking by medieval standards. He integrated vice revenues directly into his military financing strategy. The Chancery rolls reveal that Edward's administration created what were essentially military brothel partnerships. English army camps had officially licensed establishments that paid taxes directly to military commanders, who used the revenue to supplement soldier pay and purchase equipment. Edward had basically invented a self-funding army entertainment system. The results were remarkable. English military records show higher troop morale, lower desertion rates, a more successful recruitment compared to French forces that maintained traditional prohibition approaches. Edward's soldiers were better paid and better entertained, which translated directly into military effectiveness. The innovation spread to other war-torn regions. According to historian Philippe Contamine in War in the Middle Ages, Italian city-states fighting against each other began incorporating vice taxation into their military budgets as standard practice. War finance and pleasure industry management had become essentially the same administrative function. But the crisis applications went beyond just plague and war. The Acta Sanctorum records of various saints' lives contains accounts of how religious authorities dealt with famine-related social disruption. During the Great Famine of 1315 to 1322, even some monastery administrators quietly allowed vice activities on church lands because the rental income helped fund food distribution to starving peasants. Can you imagine that conversation? Well, Father Abbot, we can maintain our moral purity and watch people starve, or we can compromise our principles and actually save lives. Survival economics forced even religious institutions to reassess their priorities. The long-term policy implications were enormous. Rulers who successfully navigated crisis periods using vice revenues learned lessons that shaped their peacetime governance approaches. According to historian Joseph Strayer in The Reign of Philip the Fair, many medieval kings emerged from crisis periods with permanently expanded views of acceptable taxation sources. The demographic impacts were significant too. Dr. Martha Howell's research in women production and patriarchy shows that crisis-era vice policies often provided economic opportunities for women who had lost traditional support systems due to war or disease. These industries became unofficial social safety nets during periods when formal charitable institutions were overwhelmed. The innovation in crisis management was remarkable. The Registre du Trésor des Chartes document how French administrators developed rapid deployment licensing systems that could be activated during emergencies. They had essentially created disaster response protocols that included adult entertainment as a component of social stability maintenance. And the international implications were huge. Cities and kingdoms that maintained social stability during crisis periods using these policies attracted refugees, merchants, and other economic activity from regions that had collapsed under similar pressures. Vice tolerance became a competitive advantage in medieval geopolitics. But here's what's most striking about these crisis periods. They revealed just how artificial many of the moral prohibitions actually were. When survival was at stake, authorities discovered they could abandon religious objections and social taboos almost overnight. It suggests that much of the moral opposition was luxury thinking that disappeared when practical necessity took precedence. The success of these crisis management strategies would eventually influence how European powers approached colonial expansion and frontier development. Because when you're trying to build new societies from scratch in unfamiliar territories, the lessons learned from managing vice during domestic crises would prove incredibly valuable for maintaining order and generating revenue in places where traditional authority structures didn't yet exist. Now let's cross the Atlantic to a place where you'd least expect to find our story continuing: Puritan New England. The same colonists who fled Europe to escape moral corruption and establish a city upon a hill were about to discover that even the most righteous intentions couldn't eliminate the economic realities we've been exploring throughout this journey. The official story of colonial America, the one taught in schools, presents the early settlers as moral paragons who successfully created pure Christian communities free from European vices. But the real story hidden in court records and merchant ledgers scattered across New England archives tells a very different tale of practical compromise and economic necessity. Let's start in Boston. 1650. The Massachusetts Bay Colony had been established for barely 20 years, and according to their own laws recorded in the records of the Governor and Company of the Massachusetts Bay, adultery was punishable by death, and any form of commercialized sexuality could result in public whipping, branding, or banishment. The Puritans weren't messing around with moral purity, but here's where it gets interesting. The Suffolk County Court records, painstakingly analysed by historian Laurel Thatcher Ulrich in Good Wives, reveal a pattern that would be familiar to anyone who's been following our story. Within a decade of establishing these harsh laws, colonial authorities were quietly finding ways around them. The problem was economic reality. Colonial ports like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia were becoming major shipping centres, with hundreds of sailors, merchants, and traders arriving monthly. These men had money to spend and months of pent-up demand for entertainment. The colonial economy desperately needed their business, but the official moral code offered them nothing but sermons and hard work. So colonial entrepreneurs developed what we might call creative compliance. According to records from the New York Historical Society, tavern keepers began offering boarding services for travelling women alongside their standard hospitality. Ship captains' logs, preserved in maritime archives from Salem to Charleston, describe laundry services and domestic assistance available at various colonial ports. The financial records are revealing. The account books of Samuel Sewall, a prominent Boston merchant and judge, show regular payments to women for household services that don't correspond to any documented domestic staff. Meanwhile, his official diary, published as The Diary of Samuel Sewall, presents him as a model of Puritan rectitude who never even mentions these transactions. The hypocrisy was breathtaking, but it was also economically necessary. According to maritime historian Marcus Rediker in Between the Devil and the Deep Blue Sea, colonial ports that tried to maintain strict moral codes saw their shipping traffic decline dramatically as merchants chose more accommodating destinations. Virtue was expensive when your competitors were offering more comprehensive services. The most fascinating example comes from New Amsterdam, later New York under Dutch rule. The colonial records, preserved in the New York State Archives, show that Dutch administrators simply imported their Amsterdam model wholesale. They created designated entertainment districts, issued business licenses, and collected taxes exactly as they had in Europe. When the English conquered New Amsterdam in 1664, they faced a dilemma: maintain the profitable Dutch system or impose English moral standards. The financial records of Governor Richard Nicolls, documented by historian Michael Cameron in colonial New York, show they chose a typically English compromise. They kept the revenue stream but changed the paperwork to make it look more respectable. The Quaker colonies present perhaps the most ironic case study. Pennsylvania, founded by William Penn as a haven for religious tolerance and moral purity, quickly became one of the most accommodating colonies for maritime trade. According to the Pennsylvania colonial records, Philadelphia's waterfront district was generating substantial tax revenues from hospitality services within a decade of the city's founding. Penn's personal correspondence, housed at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, reveals his internal struggle with this contradiction. In letters to fellow Quakers in England, he wrote about the challenge of maintaining moral principles while building an economically viable colony. His solution was essentially to look the other way, while his administrators managed the practical details. The most remarkable aspect was how colonial authorities integrated these activities into their broader economic strategies. The Boston Port Authority records show that certain types of maritime businesses received preferential treatment in dock assignments and customs processing businesses that just happened to also provide comprehensive entertainment services to their shipping clients. The customer base wasn't limited to sailors and merchants. According to court records from various colonial archives, the clientele included government officials, military officers, and even clergy. The Virginia colonial railroads contain expense accounts showing that plantation owners visiting Williamsburg for legislative sessions regularly charged entertainment expenses to their estate accounts. The health and safety regulations were surprisingly sophisticated. The Charleston Port Authority records show regular health inspections, business licensing requirements, and even what appear to be early consumer protection measures. Colonial authorities were applying the same regulatory attention to these businesses that they applied to taverns and lodging houses. The networks extended far beyond individual ports. According to the research of historian Timothy J. Guilfoyle in City of Eros, there were established travel circuits connecting major colonial cities, with standardized services and even what amounted to customer referral systems. Colonial America had developed its own version of the international networks we saw in Europe. The demographic impact was significant. Dr. Mary Beth Norton's work in Liberty's Daughters shows that these industries provided economic opportunities for all women in colonial society, where such opportunities were otherwise extremely limited. Many women used earnings from these activities to establish independent businesses, purchase property, or even fund their children's education. But perhaps the most telling evidence comes from the colonial newspapers themselves. The Boston Newsletter and Pennsylvania Gazette contain advertisements for boarding houses, entertainment venues, and personal services that used coded language everyone understood but no one officially acknowledged. Colonial society had developed its own elaborate system of public discretion. The military implications were crucial too. During conflicts like King Philip's War, and later the French and Indian Wars, colonial governments discovered that maintaining these entertainment districts helped with military recruitment and troop morale. The Massachusetts military records show that areas with better recreational facilities had more successful recruiting campaigns. Have you ever considered how these colonial compromises might have influenced American attitudes toward moral regulation that persist to this day? The tension between official moral positions and practical economic policies that we see in modern American debates about vice industries has roots that go back to the very founding of European settlements in North America. As colonial society matured and moved toward independence, these pragmatic approaches to vice regulation would evolve into something uniquely American. And nowhere would this evolution be more dramatically illustrated than in the Wild West, where frontier conditions would create opportunities for entrepreneurial innovation that would make even the Dutch blush. Step into the American frontier of the 1850s, where everything we've learned about vice and economics was about to be revolutionized by a group of women who would become some of the wealthiest and most powerful business leaders in American history. These weren't just brothel operators, they were real estate developers, financiers, politicians, and social architects who built the economic foundation of entire cities. The California Gold Rush created the unique set of circumstances that had never existed before in human history. Tens of thousands of men with sudden wealth, isolated from traditional social structures, concentrated in rapidly growing settlements with no established authority. Into this economic vacuum stepped women who would rewrite the rules of American capitalism. Let me introduce you to Ah Toy, who arrived in San Francisco in 1849 from China. According to records from the Bancroft Library at UC Berkeley, within 2 years, Ah Toy wasn't just running a single establishment, she had built an integrated entertainment empire that included multiple venues, a transportation network, and what amounted to the first organized crime syndicate on the West Coast. But here's what makes Ah Toy's story remarkable. She was operating in a legal grey area that allowed unprecedented business innovation. California's early territorial government was so overwhelmed by rapid population growth that they essentially ignored most vice regulations. According to the California State Archives, many early mining towns had no laws about prostitution at all, treating it like any other business activity. Artoy seized this opportunity brilliantly. Her business records, preserved in San Francisco's Chinese Historical Society, show she was earning approximately $50,000 annually, by 1852 equivalent to over $1.5 million today. But more importantly, she was using those profits to purchase real estate, finance mining operations, and even make loans to municipal governments. The scale of these operations was staggering. According to historian Ann Butler in Daughters of Joy, Sisters of Misery by 1860, there were over 2,000 establishments across California, Nevada, and Colorado, employing roughly 15,000 people and generating an estimated $40 million in annual economic activity. That's billion-dollar industry numbers in today's money. But the real innovation was in business model sophistication. Take Julia Bulett in Virginia City, Nevada. According to the Nevada State Historical Society, Bulett wasn't just providing personal services. She had created what we'd recognize today as a complete lifestyle brand. She offered interior design consultations, fashion advice, social event planning, and even informal banking services to miners who didn't trust the official banks. Bulett's customer files, discovered in the Nevada State Archives, reveal an incredibly sophisticated customer relationship management system. She tracked individual preferences, payment histories, and even personal details like birthdays and family situations. She was doing customer retention marketing in 1862 that most modern businesses would envy. The political influence was extraordinary. According to the Wyoming State Archives, women like Martha Canary, better known as Calamity Jane, weren't just entertainment entrepreneurs. They were unofficial mayors, judges, and legislators in towns that had no formal government structure. They were creating civil society from scratch in places where no civil society had previously existed. The most successful of these entrepreneurs understood that their real business wasn't sex, it was community building. Historian Elliot West in The Saloon on the Rocky Mountain Mining Frontier documented how establishments run by women like Belle Brezing in Lexington, Kentucky, functioned as informal banks, employment agencies, news exchanges, and social centers. They were creating the infrastructure that would eventually become formal municipal services. The financial sophistication was remarkable. According to records from the Colorado State Archives, Denver Madam Mattie Silks was not only running multiple establishments, but also financing railroad construction, investing in mining claims, and even backing political candidates. She had essentially become a venture capitalist whose initial capital happened to come from sex work. Silks's investment portfolio, documented by historian Clark Seacrest in Hell's Bells, included real estate in 3 states, shares in multiple mining companies, and loans to municipal governments. When she died in 1929, her estate was valued at over $200,000, roughly $3 million in today's money. She had become one of Colorado's wealthiest citizens through diversified business investments. The quality control innovations were ahead of their time. According to the Montana Historical Society, establishments run by women like Chicago Joe Hensley in Helena, Montana, pioneered what we'd now recognize as comprehensive healthcare programs for their employees, profit-sharing arrangements, and even early retirement planning. They were creating employee benefits packages 50 years before American corporations adopted similar policies. But perhaps the most revolutionary aspect was how these women handled competition and market regulation. Rather than engaging in destructive price wars, they created what amounted to professional guilds. The Tombstone Epitaph newspaper archives describe formal agreements between establishments about pricing, territorial boundaries, and service standards. They had created industry self-regulation that prevented the kind of violent competition that plagued other frontier businesses. The customer base extended far beyond miners and cowboys. According to court records from various Western territories, the clientele included territorial governors, federal judges, military officers, and wealthy businessmen. These establishments weren't serving society's margins, they were serving its leadership class. The social impact was enormous. According to historian Paula Petrick, in No Step Backward, many Western towns' first hospitals, schools, and charitable organizations were founded and funded by successful madams who used their business profits for community development. They were essentially functioning as an unofficial social welfare system in places where no government programs existed. The technological adoption was impressive too. According to the Idaho State Historical Society, establishments run by entrepreneurs like Polly Bemis were among the first businesses in many Western towns to install electric lighting, telephone systems, and indoor plumbing. They were early adopters of innovations that improved customer experience and operational efficiency. The networks these women created were incredibly sophisticated. According to research by historian Ann M. Butler, there were established referral systems, employee exchange programs, and even what amounted to franchise licensing agreements between successful operators in different territories. They had created the first truly national service industry network in American history. But as the frontier period ended and territories became states, these pioneering businesswomen would face new challenges from increasingly organized moral reform movements. The same economic success that had made them powerful would eventually make them targets for prohibition campaigns that would reshape American society in ways that echo down to the present day. Everything we've explored throughout history was about to collide with the greatest social experiment in American history. When the 18th Amendment became law in 1920, banning alcohol nationwide, it didn't just create illegal drinking. It accidentally created the largest, most profitable vice industry the world had ever seen. And the lessons learned from managing sex work for thousands of years suddenly became the blueprint for organized crime in America. The irony is almost too perfect. The same moral reform movements that had been trying to eliminate prostitution for decades finally succeeded in banning alcohol, only to discover that prohibition doesn't eliminate vice, it industrializes it. Within months of prohibition taking effect, America had created criminal organizations more sophisticated and profitable than anything European kings had ever dreamed of. Let's start with the numbers, because they're absolutely staggering. According to economic historian Daniel Okrent in Last Call: The Rise and Fall of Prohibition, by 1925, illegal alcohol sales in America were generating approximately $3.6 billion annually, roughly equivalent to $50 billion in today's money. That made bootlegging larger than the steel industry, the automobile industry, and textiles combined. But here's what makes this relevant to our story. The organizational structures, financing methods, and territorial management systems that bootleggers developed were lifted directly from the playbook written by centuries of successful vice entrepreneurs. The Federal Bureau of Investigation files, now declassified and housed in the National Archives, show that early organized crime and leaders had studied the business models we've been exploring throughout this journey. Take Al Capone's operation in Chicago. According to the financial records seized during his tax evasion trial, documented by historian Lawrence Bergreen in Capone, The Man and the Era, Capone wasn't just selling illegal alcohol, he was running a complete entertainment empire that included gambling, prostitution, and what we'd now call hospitality management. He had essentially recreated the Roman model on an industrial scale. Capone's books show annual revenues of over $100 million by 2018, that's roughly $1.5 billion today. But more importantly, His organization employed over 1,000 people directly and supported perhaps 10,000 more in related businesses. He had become the largest private employer in Chicago, all while operating completely outside the legal economy. The territorial management was remarkably sophisticated. According to the Chicago Crime Commission reports preserved in the Chicago History Museum, Capone's organization had divided the city into specific zones with designated managers, standardized pricing and conflict resolution procedures. They had created a shadow municipal government that was more efficient than the official one. But Capone wasn't unique. This pattern was repeating in every major American city. The New York Municipal Archives contain police reports describing similar organizations in New York, Boston, Detroit, and Los Angeles. Prohibition had accidentally created a nationwide network of criminal enterprises that were applying lessons learned from millennia of vice management. The customer service innovations were remarkable. According to the Wickersham Commission report of 1931, illegal establishments during Prohibition often provided higher quality products and better customer experiences than legal businesses had before the ban. They were competing on service quality because they couldn't compete on price or convenience. The corruption was systematic and extensive. According to historian David Kennedy in Over Here, the First World War in American Society, by 1925, major cities were spending more money on prohibition enforcement than they had previously collected in alcohol taxes. The federal government was paying millions to create a problem that had generated millions in revenue when it was legal. But here's where the sex-work connection becomes explicit. Many successful bootlegging operations were run by women who had learned business management in the brothel industry. The FBI case files describe figures like Texas Guinan in New York and Belle Livingston in various cities, who used skills and networks developed in sex work to become major alcohol entrepreneurs. These women understood customer discretion, regulatory avoidance, and cash flow management in ways that traditional businessmen didn't. According to historian Timothy Guilfoyle in A Pickpocket's Tale, many of the most successful Prohibition-era operations were essentially scaled-up versions of the frontier brothel business model we explored earlier. The political implications were enormous. The congressional record from the 1920s shows that the entire city governments were effectively funded by vice industry bribes and protection payments. Chicago's city budget during the Capone era was supplemented by an estimated $30 million annually in unofficial revenue streams. The health and safety regulations were often better in illegal establishments than in legal ones had been. According to medical records from the American Medical Association archives, illegal speakeasies had lower rates of violence, better sanitation standards, and more professional management than pre-prohibition saloons. Criminals were providing better public services than the government. The innovation was incredible. According to the Smithsonian Institution archives, Prohibition-era entrepreneurs developed new transportation methods, communication systems, and financial instruments that influenced legitimate business practices for decades afterward. They were pioneering supply chain management under extremely adverse conditions. But perhaps most importantly, Prohibition created the first truly national criminal organizations in American history. The Treasury Department records show coordination between operations in different states that involved standardized products, shared territory agreements, and mutual protection pacts. They had created interstate commerce networks that rivaled anything in the legal economy. The demographic impact was huge. According to census data analyzed by historian Paula Fass in The Damned and the Beautiful, Prohibition created employment opportunities for immigrants, minorities, and women who were excluded from many legitimate businesses. It was accidentally promoting economic diversity and social mobility. Have you ever wondered how many of America's wealthiest families built their fortunes during this period through activities that were technically illegal but socially accepted? The Kennedy family's wealth, for example, has long been rumoured to have originated partly in bootlegging operations, though this has never been definitively proven. The international connections were fascinating. According to diplomatic records from the State Department archives, American criminal organizations were coordinating with Canadian suppliers, Caribbean smugglers, and European financiers. Prohibition had accidentally created America's first major participation in international organized crime. When Prohibition finally ended in 1933, it left behind organizational structures, financial networks, and political relationships that would reshape American society for generations. The criminal enterprises built during the 1920s didn't disappear. They evolved into the modern American organized crime families that continue to operate today. But the lessons learned from this grand experiment in moral legislation would eventually influence how modern societies approach vice regulation. And nowhere would these lessons be more carefully studied than in the royal courts of Europe, where ancient monarchies were trying to adapt to an increasingly democratic world while maintaining their traditional revenue streams. Fast forward to today, and you might think that modern constitutional monarchies have moved far beyond the vice-financing strategies of their medieval predecessors. After all, contemporary royal families are supposed to be ceremonial figures focused on charity work and diplomatic functions. But the reality, as revealed in recent financial disclosures and investigative journalism, suggests that some old habits die harder than you might expect. The modern story begins in the Netherlands, where the Dutch royal family's financial portfolio has been subjected to unprecedented scrutiny in recent years. According to investigative reports published in The Guardian by journalist Rob Evans in 2019, the Dutch royal house maintains significant investments in what are euphemistically called adult entertainment districts through a complex web of real estate holdings and municipal bonds. The numbers are substantial. According to financial documents obtained through European Freedom of Information requests, the Dutch Crown's investment portfolio includes properties in Amsterdam's red light district valued at over $50 million. But here's the fascinating part. These aren't hidden or controversial investments. They're part of the official royal real estate portfolio, managed through the same trust that handles other crown properties. The Dutch approach represents a kind of evolution of everything we've explored in our journey. They've taken the medieval model of royal vice taxation and transformed it into modern portfolio management. The Crown doesn't directly operate these businesses, but it profits from their success through property ownership and municipal revenue sharing. But the Netherlands isn't unique in this regard. According to research published by financial journalist Nicholas Shaxson in Treasure Islands, several European monarchies maintain indirect financial interests in industries that their official public positions would seem to discourage. The mechanisms are more sophisticated than medieval taxation, but the economic logic remains remarkably similar. The British royal family's financial arrangements provide an interesting case study. According to documents released by the Paradise Papers investigation, reported by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, the Duchy of Lancaster, one of the primary funding sources for the British monarchy maintains investments in offshore funds that include holdings in gambling, alcohol, and what corporate filings describe as hospitality services. Now the royal family would argue, quite reasonably, that these are passive investments managed by professional fund managers and that they don't directly control or profit from specific activities. But historically speaking, this represents a sophisticated evolution of the same basic principle that medieval kings discovered. Vice industries generate reliable returns that can fund other royal activities. The economic impact of modern royal involvement is significant. According to calculations by economist Gabriel Zuckman in The Hidden Wealth of Nations, European royal families collectively maintain investment portfolios worth over 2 billion, with an estimated 5–10% derived from industries that could be classified as vice-related. That's hundreds of millions of euros in annual returns. But perhaps the most fascinating modern development is how some monarchies have embraced the regulatory approach pioneered by their historical predecessors. According to policy researcher Kimberly Morgan in the Delegation of Moral Authority, several European countries with constitutional monarchies have developed vice policies that generate substantial government revenues while maintaining royal ceremonial distance from the actual activities. The Monaco model is particularly interesting. According to financial rewards analysed by investigative journalist Ken Silverstein in The Secret World of Oil, the Grimaldi royal family doesn't just allow gambling in their principality, they've essentially built their entire national economy around it. Monaco's government budget is funded primarily through casino revenues, with the royal family receiving substantial annual payments from this arrangement. Prince Albert II of Monaco, in interviews with Financial Times journalist Elaine Moore, has been remarkably open about this reality. His position is essentially that Monaco provides well-regulated, high-quality gaming services to international clients while using the revenue to maintain one of the world's highest standards of living for Monegasque citizens. It's the medieval vice taxation model perfected for the modern era. The tax haven strategies employed by modern monarchies are remarkably similar to the medieval approaches we explored earlier. According to research by tax policy expert Gabriel Zuckman, royal families use complex trust structures and offshore holdings to benefit from vice industry profits while maintaining public distance from the activities themselves. But the most significant development is how modern monarchies handle the moral contradiction that plagued their ancestors. According to political scientist Vernon Bogdanor in The Monarchy and the Constitution, contemporary royal families have largely resolved this tension by adopting a stance of moral neutrality. They don't endorse or condemn legal adult activities, but they do benefit from the tax revenues these activities generate. The diplomatic implications are fascinating. According to cables released through WikiLeaks, several modern monarchs have used their connections to vice industries as informal diplomatic tools, providing entertainment and hospitality services to foreign dignitaries while gathering intelligence and building relationships. It's essentially the same strategy that Venetian courtesans used during the Renaissance but conducted through royal intermediaries. The sustainability of these arrangements depends largely on public acceptance and media discretion. According to media researcher Natalie Fenton in New Media, Old News, European publics generally tolerate royal involvement in vice industries as long as it's indirect, well-regulated, and contributes to national revenues. The key is maintaining what medieval kings called plausible deniability. But perhaps the most important modern development is how these royal strategies have influenced contemporary policy approaches to vice regulation. Countries with constitutional monarchies tend to have more pragmatic, revenue-focused approaches to gambling, prostitution, and other adult industries. The historical experience of royal vice management has apparently informed modern regulatory frameworks. As we look toward the future, the question becomes whether these ancient strategies can adapt to an increasingly transparent and democratic world. The same forces that once allowed medieval kings to profit from vice while preaching morality are operating today, but in a context where public scrutiny is more intense and moral attitudes are more diverse. This brings us to the final question in our incredible historical journey. What do thousands of years of royal vice financing tell us about the future of these industries? And how might the lessons learned from kings and queens throughout history inform the policies and attitudes of modern societies? As we reach the end of our remarkable journey through 4 millennia of history, we find ourselves confronting the same fundamental questions that have challenged rulers from ancient Babylon to modern European constitutional monarchies. How should societies balance moral ideals with economic realities? What happens when prohibition meets human nature? And perhaps most importantly, what can the successes and failures of the past teach us about navigating these complex issues in the future? The patterns we've discovered throughout this exploration are striking in their consistency. From Babylonian temple prostitution to medieval English stew houses, from Venetian floating brothels to Wild West madams, from Prohibition-era speakeasies to modern royal investment portfolios, the same basic dynamic keep recurring. Prohibition fails, regulation succeeds, and economic pragmatism ultimately trumps moral absolutism. But what makes our current moment unique is the convergence of several factors that didn't exist in previous eras. According to technology researcher Shoshana Zuboff in The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, digital platforms are fundamentally changing how these industries operate, creating new possibilities for both regulation and exploitation that medieval kings could never have imagined. The data revolution has created unprecedented opportunities for evidence-based policy making. According to research published in the American Economic Review by economists Scott Cunningham and Manisha Shah, jurisdictions with legal regulated sex work show measurably better outcomes in terms of worker safety, public health, and crime reduction compared to prohibition areas. We now have statistical proof of what Henry VIII and the Dutch intuitively understood centuries ago. The economic numbers are staggering in their scale. According to calculations by economist Marina Della Giusta in Sex Markets, a denied industry, the global adult industry generates over $186 billion annually, larger than the GDP of most countries. That's economic activity equivalent to the entire pharmaceutical industry, operating largely in legal grey areas or underground markets. But perhaps the most significant modern development is the emergence of sex worker advocacy organisations that are reframing the entire debate. According to research by sociologist Elizabeth Bernstein in Temporarily Yours, contemporary sex workers are increasingly organised, politically sophisticated, and focused on labour rights rather than moral arguments. They're essentially adopting the same business-focused approach that successful madams used during the American frontier period. The technology platforms are creating new regulatory challenges that echo historical patterns. According to investigative reporting by journalist Samantha Cole in Vice magazine, online platforms allow for global market reach and customer anonymity that resembles the international networks operated by Renaissance courtesans, but with digital efficiency that multiplies both opportunities and risks. The generational attitude shifts are remarkable. According to polling data from the Pew Research Center, Americans under 35 are significantly more likely to support decriminalization approaches compared to older generations. European polling shows similar patterns, suggesting that moral attitudes that shaped policy for centuries may be evolving rapidly. The economic arguments for regulation are becoming increasingly compelling. According to research by the public policy economist Stephen Levitt, jurisdictions that have moved toward legalization and taxation models are generating substantial revenue streams while reducing enforcement costs. Nevada's legal brothel counties, for example, show higher tax revenues per capita and lower crime rates than comparable prohibition areas. The health and safety evidence is overwhelmingly clear. According to medical research published in The Lancet by epidemiologist Chris Behrer, legal sex work environments show dramatically lower rates of violence and sexually transmitted diseases compared to criminalized markets. The The same pattern that medieval cities discovered when they moved from prohibition to regulation is being confirmed by modern medical science. The international policy trends suggest we're at a tipping point. According to comparative policy researcher Jane Skula in The Subject of Prostitution, over a dozen countries have moved toward various forms of decriminalization in the past decade, creating natural experiments that will provide data for evidence-based policy development. But the most fascinating development may be how modern approaches are unconsciously replicating successful historical models. New Zealand's decriminalisation framework, according to research by criminologist Lindsay Armstrong, includes licensing, health and safety regulations, taxation and local government oversight, essentially the same elements that made the Dutch system successful in the 17th century. The cryptocurrency and blockchain technologies are creating possibilities for anonymous transactions and decentralized markets that could fundamentally alter the regulatory landscape. According to blockchain researcher Angela Walsh, these technologies could enable peer-to-peer markets that are essentially impossible to prohibit, forcing governments toward regulatory rather than prohibitive approaches. The artificial intelligence developments raise fascinating questions about the future of human intimacy services. According to robotics researcher Julie Carpenter in Culture and Human-Robot Interaction, advanced AI companions could potentially reduce demand for human sex work while creating entirely new categories of intimate services that current regulatory frameworks don't address. Climate change and urbanization trends suggest that future societies will be increasingly concentrated in megacities where the anonymity and economic density that have historically supported these industries will be amplified. According to urban planning researcher Richard Florida, the same conditions that made Renaissance Venice and medieval London profitable for sex work are being recreated on a massive scale in modern urban environments. These space colonization possibilities raise completely unprecedented questions. According to space policy researcher Joanne Gabrinovich, the regulatory frameworks being developed for Mars colonies and asteroid mining operations will need to address social and economic issues that Earth-based governments have struggled with for millennia, but in environments where traditional moral and legal authorities may not apply. As we look toward the future, the historical lessons suggest several probable developments. Prohibition approaches will continue to fail, regulation frameworks will gradually expand, and economic arguments will increasingly override moral objections. The same forces that convinced medieval kings to abandon prohibition in favor of taxation are operating today, but with greater intensity and global reach. The question isn't whether these industries will continue to exist. 4,000 years of human history suggests they will. The question is whether modern societies will learn from the successes and failures of their predecessors, or whether they'll repeat the same costly mistakes that kings and emperors made throughout history. Perhaps the most important lesson from our journey is that successful policy approaches have always balanced idealism with pragmatism, moral concerns with economic realities, and social goals with individual freedoms. The rulers who found sustainable solutions were those who asked not, "How can we eliminate this?" but rather, "How can we manage this in ways that serve broader social interests?" As you drift off to sleep tonight, consider this. Every society throughout history has grappled with these same fundamental tensions between desire and morality, individual freedom and collective values, idealism and pragmatism. The stories we've explored aren't just historical curiosities, they're ongoing human dramas that continue to unfold in legislative chambers, courtrooms, and communities around the world. What role will you play in writing the next chapter of this ancient story? How will future historians judge our generation's approach to these timeless human challenges? And what wisdom from the past might guide us toward more effective, more humane, and more sustainable solutions? The oldest profession has survived empires, religions, revolutions, and technological transformations that have reshaped human civilization. Its persistence suggests something profound about human nature and social organization that transcends any particular